soprattutto grazie e un applauso a lui, Adam Daich.
Thank you all for coming. It's a pleasure to be in Italy. I'd like to thank Percussion Village for having me, and Tama and Zildjian. I like to play a lot of funk and soul, hip hop, R&B, dubstep, this sort of thing. So I'm going to talk about a lot of different styles, and I'm going to start with a little bit of my favorite beats that I like to play, and sort of how they evolved from the beginning, say 1950s, and up to 2012.
Whoa.
my parents are both drummers, mother and father. They were both come from their family who plays drums also. So it's kind of in the family. And when we eat dinner, we listen to jazz, and we're talking, and then when the drum solo comes on, we stop talking, and then we go back to talking. So it's just my family. It's a tradition. I grew up. The drums was always in the house, and it was never like you must practice. It was like I wanted to practice. My father had a way of making drums look very fun, very enjoyable thing to do, which is it is the most fun because the vibration goes up into you, into your arm, into your body, and it stays with you. I'm addicted to this feeling of the vibration going into my body, and I just love drums so much. So this was, my mother was playing concerts on the drums when she was pregnant. So, and I used to, kick, so basically like, that's how I got my start. And, my father was in a band where they played all American soul music, like Tower of Power, Earth, Wind and Fire, Stevie Wonder, Herbie Hancock, James Brown, this sort of thing. And they used to play 7 nights a week for very little money, and then they would practice after the show till 5 in the morning. So that was the first band I got to see a lot. My mother would bring me as an infant to go see this band, and I remember hearing the horns and everything. And wow, like as a child, I just wanted to be a part of this somehow. So, that was my beginning. And growing up in New York, you have a lot of exposure to many different cultures and styles, from salsa to funk to hip hop to you name it, jazz, of course. So it was I was very fortunate to be born into this situation. So music in a lot of ways is very, very important to me. I used to have a jazz gig on Tuesday. When I got to middle school, I had a jazz gig Tuesday at a Middle Eastern restaurant, a kebab place, and they used to let the kids play jazz. And I had 2 rock and roll bands. One was like the Red Hot Chili Peppers, and the other one was like rock, hardcore rock. And then on Sundays, I played in the gospel church, the African American, the black church, where I was the only white person in the church, and they was just welcomed me with so much love, and I ended up playing every Sunday for all of high school in church. And I'm not so much religious. I'm just I like the spirit of music and what it can bring people up. And these people come from a very poor area. And yet, when they celebrate life at church, it was like, wow, like, it was like the music would lift these people up out of the poverty just for an hour or so for the service to make them feel good. And it made me like think about music as a means of bringing people up and making them feel good about life, So that's kind of how I got my start doing this sort of thing. And then it was. I went to Berkeley School of Music where my parents went, and I got to meet all of the students from all over the world, from Italy to Japan, everywhere, and everybody had a different style and a different way of playing, and they have all the rooms, the practice rooms, and you knock, say, excuse me, can you show me what you're doing, and they would teach, so I learned a lot from the students there. The teachers were good too, but the students were very helpful in just learning, from all over the world, the different styles. I want to talk a little bit about history for a second. Has anyone ever been to New Orleans or anywhere in the States? Been to the States? Have you heard of New Orleans? Yeah, it's the birthplace of rhythm, of American music, of R&B, of blues, of soul, jazz. Everything that is good about American music comes from this place. And basically the Africans were brought here to New Orleans, and it was a slave port. where, and they allowed the slaves to play their music, the African music that they knew. So in other parts of the country, the slaves were not allowed to play their traditional music. So this is the reason why it became very much a cultural music place. And the style comes from a lot of the parades that they would have in the streets. And this is called the second line groove, and it starts with the snare drum, and it has this this feeling of like 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And it has this heavy swing, 2 and 4. So that's where this whole clapping, because the foot does the 1. So that's why when you see people clapping on the 2 instead of the 4, that means their feet are going 1. So that's why 2 and 4 is very important to understanding the concept of all this, funk and soul and jazz. The 1 is used with the legs, with dancing, or the foot drum, bass drum, and the claps for the 2 and 4. So you try to have that. I try to have that feeling going through any beat I play. Just that good feeling thing. So I'm going to demonstrate a second line groove, and this is also something Schofield loved, because he loves the very traditional New Orleans music, and he knows it all. And I think his mother has some connection with famous New Orleans guy, and so he has this love, or so he kind of reintroduced it to me and showed me his style. So this is a second line, just a basic second line. 1, 2, 3. As the years went on and developed, it became faster and more syncopated, where the bass drum would do, instead of just boom, ba-boom, boom, boom, ba-boom, boom, and now it would go to something more like 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. He would say, I want you to play the New Orleans beat, but with a lighter touch, with a jazz touch, so he could play his stuff over the top. So then I learned to do more, instead of being very loud, I learned to just do the same thing and just quiet it. Schofield would get very excited. Oh, I love this beat, and he would want me to play it a lot, and variations of this style. So that way it had the swing, but it's not necessarily triplet like. It's kind of in between the triplet and the straight 16th, which is. Feeling and loose. That's the only way to explain it, is loose, and it has the hi-hat on the 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, just to keep the time. But the hands can be very loose and relaxed, and that's the feeling of a parade, because everyone's dancing and enjoying yourself. So nobody's thinking about this kind of tight marching band tradition that was from maybe Scotland, or where they developed the marching style. So this was a much different way of looking at, time and feel. So from this developed all the great funky beats that came out of New Orleans. And I'm going to demonstrate, a little bit of, of the styles that came out of this, which is the meters. Have you anyone heard the meters? Yes. You guys, excellent. The meters. Zigaboo Modelis, the drummer for the meters, has become a friend of mine over the past few years, and it's such an honor for me to be around him, and even just to shake his hand for me is amazing, because his style is very organic. It's the roots of New Orleans and of American music, and he still sounds very good. He's very healthy, and he plays in New Orleans every year. So I go to New Orleans to see him play once a year, and I go for 2 weeks, and I get in touch with the drums and the culture that has me in love with music, So I'm going to demonstrate one of my favorite beats from Zigaboo, Sissy Strut.
Yeah.
Do 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 oh do 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 do. I've listened to it once and I learn as best I can, and then maybe 6 months later I come back to it. I listen to it again, I go, oh, I didn't realize that. And then 6 months again I come back to it. It's like a book that you keep reading and reading and rereading and finding new things about it. Because the relationship from one note to another note, there's this amazing little dip that he has. I call it, the pocket dip, and it kind of creates this really good loose feeling that, I grew up playing, when I was young I liked to play very fast and a lot of sort of things, and he kind of, when I started listening to this and also to hip hop, I started to understand a lot about just the groove and how difficult it is to play slow and funky and have, and then you go to New Orleans, you play this, or you play it outside and people start to move a little bit, and I say, oh, it's working, so that's my goal, is to get everybody to move, So Zigaboo is very important. And also, in the 50s and 60s, jazz is very important music. I respect jazz. I love jazz. I am not so much a jazz player, but there are certain things that I learned from jazz, that it's a different touch, and it got me from being sort of a rock and roll or loud funk player to learning how to control the drums and to play light. So, if you take Thelonious Monk, Straight No Chaser, da 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 da, ba doom da 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 da, ba doo da doo da, ba doom doo da, ba doom da, ba doom da. Makes you understand the beauty of playing quietly and of just, bringing the sound out of the drum and not so it's not so much this. So, when you listen to jazz, and plus when you some of the young people here, when you get older and you have an apartment, you can't play as loud if you have your drums in your apartment. So you learn to play quiet and learn to enjoy playing quiet. And so this is very important. I remember I used to have a small apartment in Manhattan my first time living in the city, because I grew up outside of Manhattan. And I used to have to play very quietly, and I set up this tiny little kit with maybe one of these as a bass drum, and a little snare drum, and it was fun, and I used to just kind of try to get a touch on the drums, and eventually when I got to play with Schofield, all of this came into effect, and so he wanted someone that could play funk and switch to a jazz touch, a jazz sound, which is just playing quietly, so it's important to understand that you could have many different styles of touch on your instrument. You don't have to be just one dynamic, So that's that, and then we get to the 1960s, the mid 60s, and you have the great James Brown comes out with all these new rhythms, and completely shocks the world with his style. And my grandfather calls him, "What's that guy that screams?" I said, "Oh, James Brown." "Oh yeah," But it's Grandpa, you don't understand, but it's his style is very important, and his drummers, Clyde Stubblefield and John Jabo Starks. These guys are the most disciplined drummers imaginable, because their time is perfect. It's like walking on water.
Yeah.
And they never sink into the water, and they don't float above it. They walk on the water the whole time.
Yeah.
And that's my goal, is to have the time like that. No matter what I play, it's good. So I'm going to play, one of my favorite beats by James Brown is the Funky Drummer, which is a very famous beat. And it's kind of, he took the New Orleans thing, which, you can see how it develops from the second line, New Orleans. But instead of it being like, he kind of straightened out the hi-hat for this, meaning 16 notes, like. And nobody had really done this yet in backbeat music. So, so he did this beat where it's like. Is really amazing to me, because it has the New Orleans little bits of these sort of sounds that come from the snare drum that they used to do with second line. He puts it in there, but with the backbeat also on the 2 and 4. So I really love that style. And a couple other beats that were very important that Jabo, the other drummer, played. He had the swing feeling in his playing. So they had the song "Sex Machine" or "Get On Up," which is the song my parents used to put on the stereo to wake me up for school in the morning. Because I would be sleeping. And, "Get on up," okay. My mom would be dancing around my room. It's a crazy house. I have a crazy house. So, so basically bumped, to it, and when you play this for a bass player, he gets very excited, because they want to play with this kind of beat, because they know it's not about the drums and showing off. It's about creating a nice bed for the bass player to lay down in and to relax, and to feel good to play, and the other instruments to play with you. So I really love this style of playing and the discipline of just playing the simple kick. One. That's James Brown concept. One. So, you know, a lot of guys, they play a lot of bass drum, and it's like, easy. What, hit that one, so I know where it is. And then we can all feel it, you know? So I like to bring the people in, as opposed to like complicate the matter, the issue, you know? And another beat that they did that kind of changed the whole scope of music was the Cold Sweat, or Mother Popcorn beat, which is sort of like, he took the, you know, a regular beat, and then he started to move the accents around, so it's like, in my head, you know. So you know, this kind of groove is like America. Everyone was like, "Wow, like what is this?" You know, like. So I always loved this style of music and just the way it makes you feel, the way, you know, it makes you want to groove and that kind of thing. You know, and then this music, you know, that originated in Africa, that came to New Orleans and started this whole thing. And then in Africa, they in Nigeria especially, with Fela Kuti. Do you guys know what Fela Kuti is? Yeah. He's a great Nigerian musician. And his drummer, Tony Allen, took this beat and he kind of created his own African version. Wow, it went from here, across the water, and then back. You know, because they were hearing James Brown. James Brown came to Africa in the 70s, and they were very influenced. The African musicians were influenced by him now. So it's just this, you know, that's why I say inspiration is 360 degrees, because, you know, you may be inspired by somebody, but then you may inspire that person later. You know, so it's always a circle of inspiration for everybody. And then, you know, I want to touch on a little bit on rock and roll. I love rock and roll, and you know, I have much respect for the guys. The two guys that I really liked in rock and roll was Jimi Hendrix had this band called Band of Gypsies, and I recommend that you check it out if you don't know it. The drummer is Buddy Miles, and he, to me, kind of had this funky sound, but very simple. And he would open the hi-hat and, you know, dun 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 dun. So just the feeling he would create, that would create the bed that Jimi Hendrix could just lay on the cloud and create, you know. Whereas, you know, Mitch Mitchell was much different. He was a jazz player. You know, kind of like a lot of jazz chops, and so, you know, he was more famous to drummers because he did a lot more drum stuff. But Buddy Miles, to me, is the guy, you know, like the pocket guy, you know, and because you could fit his groove, it feels good in your pocket, you know. So, and then you have, you know, of course, John Bonham, which of Led Zeppelin, who I heard in interviews that he loved James Brown, and he would be in the back of the Led Zeppelin tour bus with headphones, big '70s headphones, listening to James Brown all the time. And they'd be like, John, we got a gig. Oh, okay, you know, like drink, you know, but you know, his style, when you hear him play, you know, you hear this funk, this feeling in his playing that kind of made rock and roll you know, very legitimate, you know, in the scope of the history of the music to me. Yes, I'm a big fan of that. You know, so this is like, you know, the 60s and the 70s, and then, you know, also you had in the 70s, you know, Tower of Power,